January 6, 1979. Somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, a grey winter night in Queens, New York. Martin Krugman kissed his wife Fran goodbye. He told her he was going out. He didn't say where. He didn't say with who. He walked out the front door of their home and climbed into a car that was already waiting. He was never seen again. No body, no phone call, no ransom demand, nothing. His wife Fran waited. She called his friends. She called the police. She filed a missing persons report. The local detectives looked into it. They found nothing. A Long Island housewife, married to a bookmaker and wig shop owner, standing alone in her kitchen, realizing her husband had simply vanished from the earth. But here's what Fran Krugman didn't know. Her husband hadn't just disappeared. According to testimony that would surface years later, Martin Krugman was driven to a fence factory on Rockaway Boulevard in Jamaica, Queens, a building controlled by Bonanno crime family mobster Vincent Asaro. Inside that building, Krugman was shot. Then he was dismembered. And then what was left of him was disposed of so thoroughly that to this day, nearly 50 years later, not a single bone has ever been recovered. And if you've seen Goodfellas, you think you know this man. You don't. In Martin Scorsese's film, Krugman appears as Morrie Kessler, the loud, annoying, wig shop-owning bookie played by Chuck Lowe. The guy who keeps pestering Jimmy Conway for his cut. The guy who gets an ice pick in the back of the skull in the back seat of a car after the Lufthansa heist. It's one of the most famous death scenes in cinema history. 4 minutes, quick, almost comedic, and then the movie moves on. But Goodfellas never told you the most important fact about this man. Martin Krugman didn't just participate in the Lufthansa heist. He didn't just die because of it. He was the reason it happened at all. Without Martin Krugman, there is no heist. Without Martin Krugman, there is no Goodfellas, and Scorsese never showed you that. This is the story of the man who ran a wig shop in Queens and accidentally started the biggest cash robbery in American history. A man whose tip created an empire of violence. A man whose reward for making everyone rich was to be butchered in a factory and erased from existence. The story starts not with guns or money, it starts with hair. Martin Krugman was born into a Russian Jewish family in New York City in the late 1920s. He was not a gangster, he was not a killer, he was not even particularly tough. What he was a talker, a connector, a man who knew people and who liked to be around people who had power. By the early 1970s, Krugman had built a modest life for himself. He owned a men's hair salon and wig accessories store, both called For Men Only, located on Queens Boulevard, right next door to a nightclub called The Suite, which happened to be owned by Henry Hill. That proximity would cost him his life. The Suite was a Lucchese hangout. Henry Hill ran it. Jimmy Burke drank there. Paul Vario's crew came through regularly. And Martin Krugman, the wig shop owner next door, started doing what he did best, talking. He became friendly with Hill. He started running book on the side, taking bets from the same men who spent their nights at the Suite. He kicked money up to the Lucchese family. He became what the mob calls an associate, not made, not protected, but useful. According to Nicholas Pileggi's wise guy, Jimmy Burke hated Martin Krugman from almost the very beginning. Burke didn't trust men who talked too much, and Krugman talked constantly. He bragged, he complained, he asked questions he shouldn't have asked. He was, in Burke's eyes, a liability wrapped in a toupee. But Krugman had one thing going for him that kept him alive. He had information. Specifically, he had a connection to a man named Louis Werner. Werner was a cargo agent at John F. Kennedy International Airport. He worked the Lufthansa terminal, and he was drowning in gambling debt, $20,000 owed directly to Krugman's bookmaking operation. Werner couldn't pay, so he offered something else instead. He told Krugman that once a month, Lufthansa flew in enormous shipments of untraceable American currency, cash exchanged by American servicemen and tourists in Germany. The money came in on scheduled flights. It was stored in a double-doored vault inside Building 261 at JFK. The security was minimal. The vault's alarm system had a known flaw, and Werner, who worked inside the terminal, knew the schedules, the procedures, and the exact layout of the building. This was the tip that would change everything. Krugman didn't take the information to the police. He didn't ignore it. He did exactly what a man in his position would do, he told Henry Hill. And Hill, who understood immediately what this meant, told Jimmy Burke. And Jimmy Burke, for all his hatred of Martin Krugman, listened very carefully. Because this wasn't a small score. This was the kind of job that came along once in a lifetime. Millions of dollars, untraceable cash, an inside man who knew every detail of the security system. All that was needed was a crew with enough nerve to walk in at 3 in the morning and take it. Burke had that crew, but the moment Krugman passed that tip, he set into motion a chain of events that would lead to at least 10 murders, the largest cash robbery in American history, the destruction of an entire Lucchese crew, and eventually his own death. And the cruelest part? Martin Krugman would never see a single dollar of the money his information made possible. But that part of the story comes later. And that's not even the worst part, because the heist itself went almost perfectly. It was what happened after the heist that turned Queens into a graveyard. December 11th, 1978, 3 a.m., Building 261, John F. Kennedy International Airport. A black Ford Econoline van pulled up to the Lufthansa cargo terminal. Inside it sat 6 men in ski masks and gloves. They had bolt cutters, they had handguns, they had shotguns, and they had something no amount of firepower can buy. They had the complete interior blueprint of the building, courtesy of Louis Werner, courtesy of Martin Krugman. The robbery took 90 minutes. The crew entered from the East Tower. They took the first employee hostage, senior cargo agent John Morrie, and forced him into the lunchroom where 5 other workers were on break. Mouths down, eyes closed. Nobody moves. One by one, they rounded up every person in the building. Kerry Whalen, a cargo transfer agent, noticed the van outside and tried to run. He was pistol-whipped and thrown inside. Rolf Redman heard a noise at the loading ramp and went to investigate. He was captured. Night shift manager Rudy Eirich was forced at gunpoint to open the double-doored vault. The crew knew about the double-door system. They knew that if both doors were opened simultaneously, an alarm would trigger directly to the Port Authority police unit at the airport. They knew because Werner had told Krugman, and Krugman had told Hill, and Hill had told Burke. The wig shop owner's information was perfect. 72 15-pound cartons of untraceable currency were loaded into the van, $5 million in cash, $875,000 in jewelry. The largest cash robbery in the history of the United States. At 4:21 a.m., the van pulled away. The employees were told not to call police until 4:30. The first emergency call was recorded at exactly that time. The crew drove to an auto repair shop in Canarsie, Brooklyn. The boxes were transferred into 2 cars. Burke and his son drove off in one. Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Joe Manry, and Robert McMahon took the other. And then came the first mistake. Parnell Stax Edwards had one job: drive the van to a junkyard in New Jersey owned by John Gotti, destroy it, burn any evidence inside. Simple. Instead, Stax parked the van in front of a fire hydrant outside his girlfriend's apartment in Canarsie. He went inside. He got high. He fell asleep. 2 days later, police found the van. They ran prints. Edwards' fingerprints were all over it. Within 72 hours of the heist, the FBI knew exactly which crew had pulled the job. Jimmy Burke didn't panic often, but when he learned what Stax had done, something shifted inside him. According to Henry Hill's testimony, Burke became convinced that anyone connected to the heist was now a potential witness against him. Anyone who knew the details. Anyone who could talk. And nobody talked more than Martin Krugman. In the days after the heist, Krugman did exactly what Goodfellas shows Morrie Kessler doing. He demanded his share. He had provided the original tip. Without him, there was no Werner, no blueprint, no heist, no $5 million. He wanted his cut, and he wanted it now. But here's what the movie gets wrong. In Goodfellas, Morrie is portrayed as a comic annoyance, a whiny toupee-wearing nuisance who keeps badgering Jimmy until Jimmy snaps. It's played almost for laughs. The audience is almost relieved when he dies. In reality, Martin Krugman's demands were not unreasonable. Werner had been promised a flat 10% of the take, roughly $500,000. Krugman, as the middleman who connected Werner to the crew, expected a comparable share. He had been told he would be taken care of, but Burke had no intention of sharing. According to Pileggi's wise guy, Burke had never trusted Krugman. He considered him a loudmouth, a liability, a man who couldn't keep his mouth shut in a room full of people who killed men for exactly that reason. And now, with the FBI circling, with Stax's fingerprints on the van, with surveillance helicopters following the crew, and bugs planted in the phones at Robert's lounge, the last thing Burke wanted was a bookmaker from Queens Boulevard showing up at his bar demanding money. Krugman didn't understand this, or if he did, he chose to ignore it. He kept calling, he kept showing up, he kept asking. And Jimmy Burke, the man they called the Gent because of the way he could smile while deciding to kill you, listened to every complaint. He nodded. He said the money was coming. He told Krugman to be patient. He was stalling. Because while Krugman was demanding his share, bodies were already beginning to fall. Stax Edwards was the first, shot 5 times in the head by DeSimone and Sepe on December 18th, exactly 1 week after the heist. Then came Louis and Joanna Kafora, the couple who bought a pink Cadillac with heist money and were found frozen in a refrigerated trailer in February. Then came Joe Buddha Manry and Robert McMahon, their bodies found in the back of a Buick Riviera in Flatlands, Brooklyn, also in February. Each death followed the same logic. Burke was cutting anyone who could connect him to the robbery, anyone who had spent money too visibly, anyone who had talked too loudly, anyone who knew too much, and nobody knew more about the original plan than the wig shop owner from Queens. Martin Krugman was living on borrowed time. He just didn't know it yet. But here's where the real story gets darker than anything Goodfellas ever showed, because Martin Krugman didn't just die, he was erased, and the way it happened reveals something about the mafia that no movie can capture. January 6, 1979, 26 days after the Lufthansa heist, Martin Krugman left his house on Long Island and got into a waiting car. His wife Fran watched him go. She didn't know it was the last time she would ever see her husband. She didn't know that within hours the man she had shared a life with would cease to exist, not just as a living person, but as a physical presence on this earth. According to accounts that emerged through FBI investigations and cooperating witness testimony, including later statements connected to the Vincent Asaro indictment in 2014, Krugman was driven to a location on Rockaway Boulevard in Jamaica, Queens. The building was a fence factory controlled by Bonanno family captain Vincent Asaro. It was a place where stolen goods were moved, but on this night it served a different purpose. Inside that building, Martin Krugman was shot, and then he was dismembered. Henry Hill later told investigators that Burke and Angelo Sepe had killed and cut up Krugman. The body parts were disposed of with such precision that despite decades of searching, including a 2013 FBI excavation at Burke's former property, not a single fragment of Martin Krugman has ever been found. No bone, no tooth, no trace. His for-men-only wig shop and salon on Queens Boulevard was sold by his wife Fran shortly after his disappearance. She collected $135,000 from his life insurance policy, and that was the end of Martin Krugman, at least as far as the world was concerned. But the silence around his death tells a story that's almost as disturbing as the death itself. Nobody asked questions, not publicly, not loudly. In the neighborhood, in the Lucchese orbit, among the men who drank at Robert's Lounge and the Suite, everyone understood what had happened, and everyone understood the rules. You don't ask, you don't talk, you don't remember. Fran Krugman filed a missing persons report with the local police. The detectives investigated. They found nothing. The case went cold, and it stayed cold for 35 years, until the federal indictment of Vincent Asaro in 2014 brought Krugman's name back into the light. During that trial, Asaro's cousin Gaspare Valenti testified about the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist. He described how Burke systematically eliminated everyone connected to the robbery. He described the factory on Rockaway Boulevard. He described what happened to men who talked too much in Jimmy Burke's world. Asaro was ultimately acquitted, but the testimony painted a picture of Martin Krugman's final hours that the movie never could. And here's what makes this story so profoundly dark. In Goodfellas, Morrie Kessler's death is clean, an ice pick to the back of the head in a car, quick, almost surgical, the kind of death that fits neatly into a 2-hour film. The audience sees it, processes it, and moves on to the next scene. The real death of Martin Krugman was not clean, it was not quick, and the movie didn't skip it because it wasn't important. The movie skipped it because it was too real, too ugly, too human. The dismemberment, the disposal, the absolute commitment to making sure that a man who once sold wigs on Queens Boulevard would leave no trace on this earth. That is the real face of the mafia, not the glamour, not the suits, not the wisecracking at dinner tables. This, and Scorsese, for all his genius, chose to give audiences the version they could stomach. But the real horror isn't how Krugman died. The real horror is why. He died because he talked. That's it. He died because he was the kind of man who couldn't stay quiet, who couldn't resist telling Henry Hill about the Lufthansa shipments, who couldn't resist demanding his share, who couldn't resist showing up at Robert's lounge one more time to ask where his money was. He was the source, the origin point, the man whose single piece of information made 6 men walk into Building 261 at JFK at 3 in the morning and walk out with $5 million. And for that, he received nothing, not $1. Not one thank you, not even a burial. According to FBI surveillance records from the weeks after the heist, Burke was recorded discussing how various members of the crew were becoming problems. The wiretaps at Robert's lounge captured fragments, conversations about money, about loose ends, about who could be trusted and who could not. Krugman's name came up, not with anger, not with fear, with indifference. That was the most chilling part. To Jimmy Burke, Martin Krugman wasn't a person. He was a problem to be solved. And problems, in Burke's world, only had one solution. The irony is overwhelming. The biggest cash robbery in American history started because a wig shop owner in Queens knew a man at the airport who owed him $20,000, a gambling debt, $20,000. That's what started it all. And it ended with $5 million stolen, at least 10 people murdered, an entire Lucchese crew destroyed, and the wig shop owner himself dismembered and scattered into nothing. His wife collected the insurance money, his shop was sold, his name faded. For 35 years, the only version of Martin Krugman that most people knew was the cartoon version, Morrie, the whiny guy in the toupee. But the real Martin Krugman wasn't a joke. He was a man who made a deal he didn't understand, with people he couldn't control, in a world where the punishment for talking was not silence, it was erasure. And in the end, the man who gave Jimmy Burke the tip that made him rich was repaid the only way the mafia knows how, with nothing. Nicholas Pileggi wrote in Wise Guy that Burke had hated Krugman since the early 1970s, that he tolerated him only because Krugman was useful, that the moment Krugman stopped being useful, the moment the heist was done and the FBI was circling, Burke felt nothing about killing him, less than nothing. That's the story Goodfellas never told. Not because it wasn't dramatic enough, but because the truth about how the mob treats the people who help them is not something audiences want to see. The movie gives you the ice pick, the reality gives you a fence factory in Jamaica, Queens, and a body that will never be found. Martin Krugman ran a wig shop. He owed favors to dangerous men. He passed along a tip that changed American crime history, and his reward was to be wiped from the face of the earth so completely that even his wife never got to bury him. 47 years later, Fran Krugman's question remains unanswered. Where is my husband? Nobody knows. And in the world Jimmy Burke built, that was exactly the point.